When Christians start talking about sharing their faith, that's when people start to feel uneasy. The comedian George Carlin said that religion is like a pair of shoes. Find one that fits for you, but don't make me wear your shoes. Christianity, when we start talking about sharing our faith, people think that we're trying to nag them to wear something that's dirty, something that's smelly, and something that doesn't fit. But before you start to judge those who manipulate others and try to win converts, know that there are other questionable motives for evangelism. Like the pastor that told the congregation that was losing its numbers, saying, we should really start to think about evangelism because, after all, we're called to do it, and the bank that holds our mortgage also said it might be a good idea. So whether we're trying to win converts or whether we're trying to sustain a social institution, something about it feels awkward. But Christianity, at a basic level, is about sharing good news. So what does that look like? Our passage today is from the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a great example of somebody who shares the faith. Why? Because Daniel lives our story. Daniel knows that there's a story that he's a part of, and Daniel lives like he belongs in that story. So today we're going to look at the way that Daniel lives the story and how we might learn from that. And there are two important parts of this. One, Daniel knows where he is. And two, Daniel knows where he belongs. Where he is and where he belongs. Our passage starts out today with where Daniel is. And it's in a nightmare. Daniel is having a nightmare. He's having a dream, but he's also living in a nightmare. It opens up by saying, in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon. So we have a ruler, King Belshazzar, who was a tyrant. He was an enemy of the Jews. And we also have a place, Babylon. This was the place that was the heart of injustice and oppression for the Jews. In Psalm 137, it says that this is the place where they sat down and wept, where they hung their harps, and the songs stopped. They only had a memory of their homeland where they were dragged off into exile into Babylon. So Daniel is in this place with this tyrannical leader in a place of oppression and injustice, and he's an exile. He's a foreigner. He looks different, he talks different, he acts different. But I think that one of the most important parts of what Daniel sees is that he's living in something that's part of a larger story. In his dream, in the next verse, it says that 4 beasts rise up out of the water. And each of these beasts represent 4 kings who would rise up. And all of these kings are characterized by pride and destruction. There's a description of the 4th beast in verse 7. It said, it had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that had preceded it. And then in verse 8, there are eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. So this 4th beast and the rest of them are characterized by pride and destruction. But there's one other thing that all of them are characterized by as well, and that's their own destruction. All of them would rise up and they would fall again. So why does Daniel, knowing where he is, why does this help him to live his story and be a good witness? Because he doesn't buy into it. Rulers promise to be for the people. And so while many Babylonians and Jews would say, long live the king, Daniel is saying, no, wait a minute. He's stepping back and saying that these kings would cause harm and they're not going to last forever. So Daniel knows where he is. So what about us? When we look at the context that we're living in, let's ask ourselves the question, where are we? And like the kingdoms and powers that were in Daniel's time, our kingdoms around us, they won't last forever. So let's start with the transients in politics. We've seen many nations rise up and then be brought back down. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union are a couple examples that made the history books. We've seen in recent years, a few years ago, began the Arab Spring that brought the end to many rulers in the Arab world. And we've seen post-colonial movements chisel away at the British Empire and other European powers. In the United States, we live in one of the greatest superpowers in the world. And while we often think that the end of kingdoms happens out there, or happens in the history books, we would be naive to think that this superpower will last forever. And not only does this happen in politics, but we also inhabit other stories besides just the nations that we're part of. For example, in industry, in our own city, we've seen tobacco replaced by textiles, replaced by medicine. In philosophy, in Western philosophy, we've seen modernity said that we need to cast aside our medieval traditions and that we can do everything with our minds, with science, and technology. But then we realized that those things included nuclear war and ethnic genocide. And so now postmodern philosophy has challenged those arrogant assumptions and replaced them with its own form of arrogance that deconstructs any claim to meaning or value. Some are saying that we're now in a time of postmodernism, which makes you wonder when we're going to be more creative with our titles. So we're living in these transient stories, and these stories also make promises that they can't keep. So the United States, it hails itself as a place of liberty and refuge and hope. The Statue of Liberty has inscribed on it, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, and you who yearn to breathe free." But if you ask the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses what they think, they'll likely say what Fannie Lou Hamer said: "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." In industry, companies will come out with a new innovation and say that they're going to change the world with that innovation. And then another invention will come along and make that look funny because it was something of the past. And in philosophy, somebody will say they've figured everything out, but that's just going to be replaced by another more compelling idea. So I'm making a lot of generalizations here, but what I'm saying is this, that you're part of a story and there's nothing that you can do about it. So before you think that you're an independent free thinker, think again, because there's a story that gave you that very thought. And these stories, they come and go like the flowers of the field. As Christians, the way that we relate to these stories is not that much different from Daniel. Like Daniel, we are also in exile. The Apostle Peter says, "Live in reverent fear during the time of your exile." The author of the Hebrews says that we don't have a lasting city here, but we are seeking that city which is to come. So we're told over and over again not to make ourselves too at home. So Daniel saw all of these kingdoms and the powers around him, and he was terrified. It says in verse 15, Daniel wakes up and he's terrified. So let me ask you, how often are you terrified? Or do you just welcome these alliances without challenging them? As I said before, there are two things that make Daniel live his story. One is that he knows where he is. But those who just analyze the world around them as critics, they end up just being cynical. They condemn everything around them, but they still participate in it. But Daniel is different. Daniel has a different story. He lives a different way. He recognizes that these things are going to come and go, but he lives by the practices that make him distinct from the rest of the world around him. He doesn't separate himself in a utopian bubble, but he lives differently right there in the heart of Babylon. Daniel remembers his story when he's in exile. He remembers how God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt and brought them through the wilderness. And he knows that this kingdom will continue. In verse 14, it says that his dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So Daniel knows that he's part of a different story. He doesn't just know where he is, but he knows where he belongs. But I think that one of what's even more important than the way that Daniel remembers his story is the way that Daniel and the other young men that are brought to Babylon, the way that they live the story. The people of Israel have many practices that makes them distinct from the rest of the people around them. And Daniel and his friends, they lived by those practices. So they have certain ways of eating. So when they're told to eat the food that's sacrificed to idols, they refuse to eat it. They have the commandment to worship the Lord their God only. So when they're told to bow down before the king, they refuse to do it. Daniel's life is sustained by his prayers to God. So when he's told that he can only pray to the king, he opens his window and prays 3 times a day. So the people of Israel, they lived the story by having these different practices that make them distinct from the others around them. So when we look at these stories, in what ways do we live differently from the rest of the world around us? As the people of Israel are living this different way in Babylon, God delivers them from all these places. It gets them in trouble. They get thrown in the furnace. They get thrown in the den of lions. But their witness isn't necessarily in the way that God delivers them. Rather, it's in their willingness to live differently regardless of what the outcome was. In chapter 3, this is where Daniel's friends are thrown in the furnace of fire. And they say, "If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Our witness is in believing so strongly in God's reality that we're willing to live differently no matter what the outcome is. Look around you. Really, look at the sides. Look up here. All around us, we see signs that remind us that we're part of a different story. Every Sunday when we come here, we see the cross come down this aisle. And that reminds us that we worship a king who died on the cross and rose from the dead. We have the gift of seeing our story depicted on these stained glass windows. We see Jesus, his mother Mary. We see the prophets and the disciples. Daniel didn't make the stained glass window, but here we see Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. They also prophesied about Babylon. And this reminds us that the same story that we're talking about today was the story that we're hearing about 2,500 years ago. So every Sunday we come here to be reminded that we're part of a different story. But where the rubber really meets the road is with this question. Can we really trust this story? A lot of times this story is really hard to trust. I went through a period when I was in college when I heard so many different ideas about the world, and many of them contradicted what I believed about Christianity. And for a time, I thought I was going to leave the faith because I couldn't reconcile these ideas I was hearing and what I believed. And what made it even more difficult is that our history is messy. Not only do we have these great examples of faith, but we also have people who have confessed that they're part of the people of God, that they buy into the practices in this world. They don't live that different lifestyle that makes them distinct from the rest of the world around them. So as I looked around me, I didn't see the church looking much different from the rest of the world. But at the same time, I didn't really find much hope anywhere else. As I was kind of piecing together all these different ideas, I took a little idea here, I took another idea here, and I was constructing this hyper-individualized view of the world, a kind of, Burger King, have it your way, Reynolds, Chapman worldview. And so, but this whole time, the one thing that I couldn't get away from was Jesus. The life that Jesus lived, the things that Jesus taught, the witness of Jesus' resurrection made it so that I couldn't completely leave what I had known behind. And what added to the compelling story of Jesus was not only his life, but the community that he was a part of. Because for many generations before Jesus, the people of Israel listened to the promises, waited for those promises to be fulfilled. And when Jesus came, He gathered outcasts and nobodies who ended up dying to witness to the story of Jesus. And so for the past 2,000 years, this is what the church has witnessed to. People give their lives to witness to this. And I realized that I couldn't construct a view of the world that even held a candle to the story that the church had told for millennia. And this is why we celebrate All Saints Sunday. Because the people that have come before us remind us that we have a story to tell. They remind us that we are part of something different. And we don't tell that story because we're trying to manipulate people. And we don't tell the story because we're trying to sustain a social institution. But there's no doubt that we tell the story. We tell it with our mouths and with our lives. We live the story. We live it in word and in deed. We live the story because the story has grabbed hold of us. And we believe that unlike the other kingdoms around us, this story will not pass away. This is why we celebrate All Saints Sunday. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Ann Smith to come up. And she's going to read names of people in this congregation who have told that story, who have lived that story. And we're going to honor the saints of this congregation who we remember and who we carry on the tradition of. Amen.